Continuing our coverage of the student debt crisis in this country, our next guest has written what I consider to be an important issue brief on this subject. You know, we like to think that government policy in this area is all built around what is in the best interests of students and their families, former students, and so on. But is that really the case? What has our policy done over the last 10, 15 years to help them as opposed to some other parties involved in the student debt process and so on? Our next guest has looked at that issue in some detail. Julie Margetta Morgan is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. She is a former senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Before that, she was a senior policy advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren, somebody we like. She was responsible there for developing and implementing policy proposals on a range of education issues. And before that, and then we won't go all the way back to her childhood, but she was, before that, director of post-secondary access and success at the Center for American Progress. She has a PhD and a JD and from Boston College, and she joins us now. Julie, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And by the way, post-secondary access and success, that's pretty catchy. I would have added excess, but that's why I don't get those jobs. So, okay, your paper, your issue brief or white paper, whatever we call it, who pays, how industry insiders rig the student loan system and how to stop it. That title alone reflects a little bit of a conclusion, does it not, that industry insiders are rigging the system?
Well, I think it does. I mean, I certainly went into writing this paper with the observation from my time, you know, working as a policy advocate and then also working on the Hill that when students and borrowers and their advocates go to Congress and the Department of Education and they ask for relief from their student debt, whether it's, you know, a change to the interest rate or unreasonable fees or even to cancel the debt altogether, they're sort of told that we shouldn't give bailouts to students. They shouldn't expect handouts from the system. And yet, based on my experience, there are bailouts and handouts available in the student loan program, just not to the students and borrowers. We can cite, I mean, in my issue brief, I cite maybe 7 or 8 examples, but I could probably list 15 off the top of my head, where servicers, lenders, colleges have gone to the Department of Education or to Congress asking for something that if borrowers asked, it would be pretty unreasonable, and they get it fairly easily.
Well, you know, we can go through some of the specific examples you found, Julie Morgan, but it seems to me that there's underlying all of this, underlying all the policy detail, is what might be described as a cultural or contextual problem, for lack of a better word. It's almost seems like a sociology issue, or maybe it's a political science issue among our policymakers, that, or maybe it's both, but when we look at the needs of students who are supposed to be who this policy is all about and who the institutions forming the policy are all about, there's a different kind of cultural norm that comes into play that basically says any sort of assistance or relief offered to those students or former students, borrowers, is a giveaway, is something for nothing, violates our core values of you work for every penny you get and they're not working for it, so they don't deserve it. But when it comes to banks or other institutions getting a payday for essentially doing nothing at government expense, that somehow is okay within the context of these norms. Is it an interesting sociology problem? Is it a kind of legalized corruption? What do you imagine is behind that?
I mean, I think it's both. I think there's certainly soft corruption within the entire policymaking apparatus from Congress to the Department of Education that greases the system, right? So we have loan servicers, formerly lenders in the program who are now loan servicers, and then colleges that have very high-paid lobbyists who spend all their time working relationships on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, and within the Department of Education. And, you know, that lobbying then, I don't know that it leads to, but it certainly is interrelated with the revolving door at the Department of Education, where you have I don't want to use abbreviations that I don't explain. So federal student aid is the portion of the Department of Education that controls the student loan program. We usually call it FSA. So federal student aid is staffed in many cases by people who have worked at those loan servicers or will leave FSA to go work for a loan servicer. So if it's not out and out corruption in terms of the exchange of money back and forth, it's certainly a place where the interests and needs of servicers and for-profit colleges are met with a lot of sympathy. And we've seen, we've seen this under previous administrations. It's not just a problem of the current administration, but we've certainly seen with Secretary DeVos that she has installed a number of people in key positions at the Department of Education who came from those industries. So I think that there is that layer of corruption at the heart of all of this. But in my paper, I make the argument that if the system were all just about corruption, it would be hard to sustain the kinds of bailouts that we've seen for as long as they've been able to do it. So I contend that there is, what you're sort of calling like a sociological element to it here, which I think of as a policy element, which is that, the student loan program was designed with the expectation that student loans were there to provide access to a better life. You know, it was a necessary and generally benign tool to get people into a better life. And that notion has been reinforced by economists, kind of like centrist economists who work on higher education, who generally show that, most people are okay. Their measure of being okay is being able to stay current on their loans. It's not like, are you living a good life, right? It's just, are you paying back the debt? So there's this sense within the Department of Education and within the policymaking community that, there may be some small problems in the student loan program, but by and large, students are doing okay and they're achieving that goal of providing access to a better lifestyle. And then two, the Department of Education feels like it's tasked with protecting the interests of taxpayers, defined in a very narrow sense, that taxpayers' interests are best protected when as many of the dollars that go out the door come back in, and when the student loan program doesn't cost the taxpayers at all. So I think those factors really play into it.
Yeah, and just to hit on that, they're all very insightful. But the second one the last one I want to hit on a little bit more, Julie Morgan, which is the idea that I understand how institutional cultures develop. I understand that people may know people who work for-profit colleges, who maybe worked alongside someone who became a lobbyist or a representative, social relationships and so on, or you see people at conferences, et cetera, et cetera. But the end result of a situation where you view education in terms of what's best for the taxpayer is one where your constituency becomes, in effect, that percentage of the population that pays federal taxes, and not that percentage of the population that is counting on you to provide access to education for themselves. In other words, maybe these folks just don't meet ordinary students, people trying to improve their lives by getting an education. Maybe these people don't meet the kinds of folks who need help, who are being buried under student loans and so on. And maybe it's a matter of extending somehow their perceptual universes. I mean, I'm getting a little airy here, but making sure that the universe of people they consider includes these kinds of individuals. What do you think?
And I think that's right. I think you know, there's a generational shift that has to happen. The circumstances of student debt are very different for you know, my generation and below than they are for people who are slightly older. And you know, there are some people at the Department of Education who may not be well situated. You know, first of all, they generally went to colleges that were likely to have a better payoff, right, than some of the colleges that students are currently attending. But they also were coming out into a workforce where their wages were better able to sustain a lifestyle. So right now we have the situation where students are taking on a lot of debt, but their wages are stagnant. And so even when they are repaying their debt, they're not seeing the kind of, you know, boost in their lifestyle that people did 30 or 40 years ago. So yeah, I do think that is right. I think the other piece that I don't really get into in the paper, but I think this is where it becomes sort of like a policymaking problem, is, you know, the Department of Education, right, our government and the way we pay for things and the way we think about how we pay for it is so segmented that the Department of Education, there is no direct connection between the cost of the student loan program and the cost of the other things the Department of Education wants to achieve, right? Functionally, there's no relationship between them, but the people who work there worry that if the loan program becomes more costly because we let more people discharge their debt or because we enroll more of them in income-based repayment or whatever, it's going to affect their ability to get appropriations for other programs that they care about. And so, you know, in many cases, those aren't people who are corrupt. They're people who say, I've got to protect the Pell Grant program. And we become more vulnerable if the student loan program costs money. Obviously, I don't think that's the right way to look at it, but I do think there's a structural problem there in the way the departments function that's an impediment.
So is this one reason why you, for example, in your issue brief, talk about the fact that 25 years ago, Congress instructed, in effect, the Department of Education to provide relief for some for-profit college borrowers, if I'm recalling the issue brief correctly, and yet it still hasn't happened? Is that one of the reasons why, would you say?
I think that one is a straight up, I mean, I'm speaking a little bit out of turn on this one, but I think that one's a straight up corruption, or let's say being overly sympathetic to the needs of industry. So, well, I guess, you know what, I'm going to take that back. It's a little bit of each. So the provision that we're talking about, the borrower defense provision, the way it's written in the law is fairly straightforward. The Department of Education should design a process for borrowers who are defrauded by their schools to use that as a defense against having to repay their debt. The department basically issued regulations that were extremely narrow and never created an application process or any way for people to use this provision, right? And advocates for years have been asking the Department of Education and trying to file applications under this provision, but they don't know how to do it because nobody ever created the process. And what it really comes down to is the provision of the law does not require the Department of Education to recoup the money that is discharged in any way, but the way the regulations have been written, that's exactly what they envision doing. They'd say, you know, this student was defrauded by their school, the government will discharge their debt, but we'll turn around and get the money from the colleges. And that's where that taxpayer thing comes into play, right? It's right. Like, we got to protect the government here, we've got to protect our taxpayers. But the other piece is, like, the schools then lobby against these provisions because they don't want to be on the hook. So when in the last couple of years, this provision has been under negotiation, and the Obama administration had a real interest in doing something here. And in fact, they did do something. But a big part of the negotiations were driven by whether and how they would get the money back from the schools and whether or not the process was fair to the schools.
Right.
rather than to the student.
So it's really it's a process focus, it's a balance sheet focus, it's not a student or former student focus. So, people who know me, and again, we're talking with Julie Margetta Morgan of the Roosevelt Institute, people who know, I guess in conclusion, people who know me know that I think we should just cancel all student debt because I think the system has trapped people into a kind of student loan indentureship. But even beyond that, it seems that we need structural reforms in the way the Department of Education looks at these loans and the way lawmakers look at the loans, and that we really need to shift the ground of our conversation on this. We have about a minute left, Julie. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think that one of my my recommendations in the paper are that we sort of shift the way that the advocacy community and the research community think about the student loan program and the questions that they're trying to answer around what's best for students and what's best for taxpayers. And I think as we start to do that, we peel away at some of the corruption, we peel away at some of the misperceptions about what's best for everyone involved in the system. But I do think inevitably as we get down that line, we see that, this is a social experiment that's failed, right? That we have done more harm than good to students. And so, it's very possible that we end up exactly where you are because you're just telling the future here.
Okay, well, I hope so. I certainly hope so. And if we do get there, it will be in large part because of the great work of folks like you. So, Julie Margetta Morgan, fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. I encourage people to read your paper, Who Pays? How Industry Insiders Rig the Student Loan System and How to Stop It. It can be found at rooseveltinstitute.org/who-pays. So, Julie, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.